Hi, this is Discovering the Gospel in Every Book of the Bible, and today we're going to look at Genesis. Now, what I want to do each time is talk about how this book of the Bible moves the storyline of the entire Bible along. Then secondly, how the principle of the gospel of grace is illustrated or given to us by this book. And then lastly, how the book especially shows us Jesus. And first of all, how does this move the story along? In some ways, Genesis is it's obviously the beginning of the story, and the storyline of the Bible is creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And so Genesis probably has more chapters of the storyline of the Bible in it than any other book. Because here we have the story of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. We have the story of the fall in Genesis 3, where human beings turn away from God and all that good world falls into corruption, and they are, the human beings are exiled. And for the first 11 chapters of Genesis, basically you see things getting worse and worse. So Genesis 1 to 11 is about creation and fall, and very little about redemption, though you see little spots of places in Genesis 1 to 11 where God is being gracious. He's being gracious to Cain, by putting a mark on him so he's not killed. But basically, all you see in these first 11 chapters is sin and the corruption of sin getting worse and worse. So you have the flood. You have the Tower of Babel. And so things are getting worse and worse. But then suddenly, there's a turning point in the story of the whole Bible, and also in Genesis 12, where God, in a proactive, systemic way, you might say, comes to one man, Abraham, and says, I'm going to save the world through your family. I'm going to make you a great people. And I want you to, therefore, leave the comfortable place you are, leave your comfort zone, leave your homeland, and go out into the wilderness where you're always going to be wandering and you're always going to be a pilgrim, and you're never really going to have a settled home. But I'm asking you to do that so that I can turn your family into the basis of the people of God, out of which will come the Savior. And so that's the great storyline change right there, the plot. And after that, in the book of Genesis, you'll see both Abraham and then his son Isaac and then his son Jacob, his grandson Jacob, all struggling with this great promise, which in a sense points to the fact that human beings, mere human beings, are never going to be able to completely fulfill this promise, that there's going to need to be a greater Abraham, a greater Isaac, a greater Jacob at some point. But now that's the storyline. And also the other thing about the storyline, the way Genesis contributes to the storyline of the Bible, is when you go to the book of Revelation and you see the new heavens and new earth, it's intriguing that you have the tree of life in it, which in a sense shows that that the new heavens and new earth are going to be Eden renewed. And so the Garden of Eden, developed now into a great, wonderful garden city, is the goal of the whole universe. And unless you understand Genesis, you're actually not going to see where God is taking the world. But let's talk secondly about the principle. The gospel principle, we have said, is that you're saved by grace, not by your good works. And there's two things you see in the book of Genesis that really help us begin to understand this principle of how God saves. The first one is the principle of God's salvation through rejection. So there's a sense in which Abraham saves the world by leaving his comfort zone and wandering as a pilgrim. In other words, it's really through a form of suffering. And then you also see, for example, even Jacob. Jacob ends up being a vessel for God's salvation, but only after he has to run away and, in a sense, go into exile to leave his family and come back. Joseph, at the very end of the book of Genesis, Joseph is put into exile in Egypt and rejected by everyone, but then rises up at the end to be able to save his family. And so this pattern in which God saves through the rejected one, God saves through the person who's been cast out, is going to find, of course, its climax in Jesus himself. The other thing that's fascinating, I think, about the book of Genesis that gets us into the principle of salvation is the fact of blessing. My friend Tremper Longman has written a commentary on Genesis in which he points out that the word blessing is very, very central to the book of Genesis. First of all, we think of the word blessing, and the English word blessing doesn't get across what the Hebrew word blessing does. It means deep fulfillment, deep fulfillment. And in the very beginning, when God creates Adam and Eve, he blesses them. And so they were in a blessed state, but as soon as they left, as soon as they were exiled because they turned away from God, they lost that blessed state. And what you have in the rest of the book of Genesis, it's pretty intriguing. You have people trying to bless themselves. So, for example, Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, they're building this great skyscraper. We're going to make a name for ourselves, then we're going to know who we are. Or poor Jacob, when he realizes his father doesn't love him as much as he loves Esau. I mean, by the way, favoritism in a family is just terrible. And when you know that your parents love the other siblings more than you, it's awful. And as you know, the story, Jacob disguises himself as Esau so that he can hear his father bless him, even though his father would think he's Esau. I mean, it's just pathetic, and it just wrings your heart. But here's what's fascinating: near the very end of Jacob's life, Genesis chapter 32, he ends up wrestling with God, a mysterious angel of the Lord who ends up being, he finds out, is God. And as the sun starts to come up, and this mysterious stranger says, "I have to leave because you cannot see my face and live." Suddenly, Jacob realizes he's wrestling with God. And then, you know what he says? "I will not let you go till you bless me." I have never been more moved than when I realized that Jacob suddenly realized what you and I need to realize, and that is the fulfillment we've been looking for in work, in building skyscrapers, in having wonderful spouses, in having lots of children, in making money. The blessing we've been looking for is actually in the face of God. The blessing we need is in Jesus himself. Jesus is the true Abraham who, in order to save us, went out not knowing whither he went. Jesus is the true Isaac who was not just offered up, but actually lost his life. So that just as God could say to Abraham, "Now I know that you love me, because you did not withhold Abraham, your son, your only son, whom you love, from me," we can say to God about the true Isaac, looking at the cross, "Now we know that you love us, because you did not withhold your son, your only son, from us." Jesus is the true Joseph, because even though he was rejected, he rose up so he could forgive his brethren and save them. So Jesus is all through the book of Genesis, but the most important thing I would say is it's in the face of Jesus Christ that you will finally get the blessing you're looking for. And that is discovering the gospel in the book of Genesis.